Welcome to the Ironcenturion podcast, a Christ-centered adventure into leadership, manliness, and brotherhood. Michael, Tyler, it's good to have you guys in the virtual studio with me today.
Yeah, this is fantastic. Tim, this is the episode we've been promising for a while. And so we have Tyler, who's been with us before. Tyler's the guy who, Tyler came and told us all about astrophotography. We talked about a man and his hobbies. I think that was one of our first episodes. It's good to have you back with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, guys.
Yeah, so last time we talked about something that was easy, and we said it took very little preparation because it's our hobbies, the things we love and enjoy. This one took a little bit more effort, didn't it?
This is about the exact opposite of that episode in terms of prep work on our end, and yeah, and what we're asking of you as listeners too, because we did request that you guys take some time and listen to this one on your own.
Yeah, in advance of this discussion. So if you don't know what we're talking about, Tyler, would you tell us about this thing that you've done and then you shared with us, so we joined in too?
Sure. Yeah. So this is a conference that Professor John Coe at Biola put on for a church, and it's on spiritual development. And the reason we chose this, and for me in particular, how I got introduced to it, is this has been a very impactful thing for me in the last year or so. Last year and even into this year has been just a very difficult season of life for me. And I think for our staff on Ironcenturion, I would say this has been difficult for almost everyone on our staff. And I really appreciated when me and Tim were starting to talk about this series that I had gone through, and Tim had actually heard about it and gone through it himself on his own as well. We kind of got to the beginning of this year and we said, we really need to take a step back, and for our whole staff, let's regroup and let's use this as an opportunity to go through this together and talk through what does it look like to grow spiritually, especially through those difficult seasons, which is a lot of what this conference is about.
Yeah, so we're actually meeting as a staff weekly over our text thread that we meet on, and we go through these lessons. There's 5 different lectures that are about 2 hours a piece, but there's five of these lectures, and we talk about one each week. So it's been a good rhythm to kind of get into, to listen through something, wrestle with it for that week, and then meet together as a staff and kind of talk about our thoughts and feelings. So we actually haven't, even as a staff, made it all the way through the lecture series yet. I think the 3 of us have kind of sped ahead to get this episode out. But yeah, that's been a really good thing. It's something that you guys could do with your friends at home as well. If this resonates with y'all, you could pull some guys together and listen to it as a group.
Yeah. So let's talk about a little bit about how we're going to do this. I think we should say there's no spoilers. This is a series on spiritual maturity, so there's not like a whole lot of surprises in it. I mean, that doesn't mean there's not good content in it, but there's no
content you haven't heard before. Or, concepts that you haven't heard before.
Yeah, but there's no twist ending, right? I mean, there's no like, oh, it wasn't that guy. It's this guy who's alive that stabbed the dude. There's no surprise murder mystery thing here. So spoiler is meaning like you can listen to this whole episode that we're recording right now and then go listen to the spiritual development series, and you won't necessarily feel that much out of order. You will probably, though, get more out of it if you've listened already to the spiritual development series. Would you agree, Tyler?
Yeah, I think so. But this is actually my second time going through it, and I feel like I learned even more the second time. So whatever order you go through, this is the type of thing that I think the more you listen to it, the more you take in these topics, I think you'll find different aspects to apply to your life each time. So
that's good. Okay, so here we've got 10 hours of recorded lecture content that we've listened to, we've made notes on and thoughts. But Tyler, how do we do this? What are we going to do now? What are your thoughts?
I think we need to break it down, probably lecture by lecture, and spend 5 to 7 minutes, probably max, on each one, and kind of talk about some of the highlights of that and what some of the personal implications were, so we don't get too long-winded in this episode, because I think what Dr. Coe really has to say largely speaks for itself. So really what we're going to be talking about on here, I think, is kind of some personal application points, things that kind of hit home for us. So.
Okay, that's good, because that's the notes that I basically made, is things that really stood out to me and were convicting or were inspiring. I just kind of made notes of those or highlighted them or jotted those down. So
Cool.
That seems to fit well. All right. So, well, should we start with lecture 1?
Yeah, I think one more quick editorial comment. If you're new to the podcast, or if you don't really know a whole lot about who we are, we're all laymen, right? None of us are seminary graduates. None of us have official positions within a church where we preach and teach on a regular basis. This is just kind of we're disciples right along with most of our listeners, I would imagine. So take that with a grain of salt with everything you're about to hear. But as always, we try to do our best to have the things that we say be in line with Scripture. So, but evaluate it for yourself. All right, that's enough of an editorial. Let's jump into lecture 1.
So this first one, I wrote down, it's resisting the temptation of moral formation. And I think the reason he starts here, and this has been so helpful for me, because eventually the theme, if you haven't gathered, the theme of what he's trying to get to is, what do we do when we're going through dry times in the spiritual walk? This is really a series that's primarily, I would say, for those who are maybe mature believers who have been a Christian for a while, especially maybe if you've grown up in the church. There might be a certain level of dryness that you experience over time. And he asks the question, is that normal? Is that something wrong with me? And so he doesn't jump right to, so what do I do to fix it? I think it's important that he starts at this one, which is, what do we do with the fact that we often try to respond to that with a desire to put on legalism or fix ourselves by our own efforts and our own work? So I think that's kind of how I would summarize this one as we dive into it.
Yeah, the thing that was interesting for me too is I wasn't quite sure what to expect for this, because Tyler, you'd been through it before. Tim, you've listened to this at least before or ahead of me. And so this was all new for me. I listened to this for the purposes of the conversation we're having right now. So I was coming to this pretty cold, pretty new to it, didn't really know a lot what to expect. And I think that was what caught me off guard the most in a refreshing way, is that it really is truly how to grow as a believer who is already at some level of maturity and growth. So I would say that means that if you're listening to the podcast right now and you're not a believer, or you're a new believer in Christ, this has got good information for you in it, and don't shy away from it. But it's not intended directly for you. It's intended more for those who have already moved a certain way in depth in their walk with Christ. And I found that surprising and refreshing, because what I have seen is most talks on spiritual growth and maturity pretty much start at the, okay, so you've trusted Christ, now what stage? And this was much more of a, you've trusted Christ, you've been walking with him for a long time, and some of the emotional experiences of trusting Christ, the excitement of all the novelty and the newness has worn away. The excitement of some of the things that can happen in the Christian life that are exciting, you've done those already, and some of them can begin to feel repetitive or maybe even old hat in some ways. And so he's starting there and addressing that next step and stage. And I found that to be impactful for my own life.
And the verse that stood out to me that he referenced a lot in this section was Galatians 3:3. In fact, the whole letter of Galatians is really very key to this topic. But that verse says, are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? In other words, I think we all, if we've had a genuine conversion experience, we know that we're a Christian because the Holy Spirit's done a work in our lives to change our hearts. And a lot of times, like you mentioned, Michael, that often comes with a lot of emotion. We are supposed to love God with our whole heart and soul and mind and strength. And so there's an emotional aspect to that. But often we start with the Spirit, but then like the Galatians, we can go on in the flesh. And I found myself wrestling with this a lot, especially in my adult Christian walk. You get outside of youth group in high school and then even college. And now you're kind of on your own and you just want that emotional high back. Why don't I feel God the way that I did before? And I rode this roller coaster all through my adult life. And I'm still wrestling with it now. Like Tim alluded to, we're not experts. I'm here to say this is the struggle I'm on right now, but it's a struggle with the Lord rather than up to this point. So often I look to myself And that's where I've gotten really discouraged. And I think I've had a lot of I'd almost say spiritual depression as a result of beating myself up so much about, if I'm not feeling the Lord, that must be my fault, or I must be trying harder. And those are kind of the two extremes that I would just bounce back and forth between, which is pride and despair. And this was like a breath of fresh air to kind of take a step back. But he first has to walk us through that temptation that we all have, which is, in these times of dryness, we want to cover ourselves up, or we want to hide from the fact that we still wrestle with sin, rather than come out in the open and come to the Lord, let that draw us into the Lord.
Yeah, there's definitely that bent to say, well, if something's wrong, I'm going to fix it. I'm gonna pull myself up by my bootstraps. I'm gonna double down on quiet times. I'm gonna try some new spiritual disciplines that I haven't done before, and by golly, we'll get this fixed in no time. And it just doesn't work, right? I mean, yeah, Tyler, you alluded back to high school, and when he was talking about some of these things, I immediately had flashbacks to you and I leading high school youth group together, and just some of those spiritual highs that the Lord allowed us to experience when we were at that stage in our walk. But I listened to this right after I'd gotten married, so we're talking 10 to 12 years ago at this point that I listened to this series for the first time. I don't think I was quite ready for it at that point, because it's definitely brought a lot more richness and depth as I've listened to it again for studying for this episode here. But yeah, just that, I think when I listened to it for the first time, I was still kind of riding those waves of emotional highs that were attached to my walk with Christ. And I think it's almost the same as marriage, right? Like, you have that honeymoon stage, and then there's times where it's dry and it's work, and you've got to put in the work. And I think that's kind of the stage in life that he's really addressing here with Christians that are no longer having those highs emotionally. But what that means is not that God is distant, but he's calling us to something deeper.
Yeah.
And that's encouraging.
And the image,
go ahead, Tyler.
I was just going to say that the image that really stood out to me from this lesson was in the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve sinned for the very first time, and their relationship with God was different for the very first time. And their immediate reaction was one of hiding and covering themselves up, right? They sewed together fig leaves, and they went and hid behind trees to try to hide from God, all-knowing, omniscient God. But that's such a revealing thing in our heart. And he says we all have that in us, that when we see our own sin, our natural inclination, now that sin is in our heart, is that we want to hide and we want to cover up. And so a lot of times what we cover up with is goodness. We try to cover ourselves, our badness, with, if I just am good enough, or if I try hard enough, that will make me feel less shame or less guilt, as opposed to, what if Adam and Eve, instead of running and hiding and covering up, what if they had actually gone to God and say, God, we messed up. We're so sorry. And he asked that question of like, what would have happened? And we won't know. We don't know. That wasn't part of the plan. But that challenge is now to us. When we sin, when we see that we have this ugliness inside of us, are we willing to have the humility to come to the Lord in dependence and openness and honesty? And that's where he's really going to lead us in these next several sections.
That's probably the biggest note that I made about this and how it relates specifically to Ironcenturion. I wrote down, as a result of this first conversation, or first lecture, that we should be cautious of misunderstanding our hold fast principle in this context. That hold fast is about perseverance, but it's not about this like bootstrapping spirituality, the just be good or more idea. It's about something different, and we need to be careful not to get the two confused. And that really stood out to me, that we make sure we're clear in our communication and our understanding of what that hold fast principle isn't about legalism. It's not about doing things the right way and better, so that we can grow on our own efforts and initiative and cover up the sin. And so that stood out to me quite a lot.
One of the things that I've been on a huge tear for in my own life recently is eliminating the language of talking about being a better fill in the blank, right? A better Christian, a better father, a better husband, because that's not the Christian life, right? That is a self-help book life. The gospel doesn't call us to be better. The gospel calls us to Christ because he is the only better. So how do we become more like Christ is what I'm trying to grow in my desire for, not to be more polished, more refined on the outside. It's that whole, parable of cleaning the outside of the cup or the inside of the cup. What are you more concerned with? So I think that's a good segue to the second lecture series, which is titled "Why We Sin When We Know So Much." Already starting swinging for the fences with the title, like, why can't we just get over this whole sin problem?
Well, and that one of the things I grabbed out of that were two quotes that he gave. He actually used it in his introduction, but he gave a quote from John Calvin in his Institutes of Christian Religion, where he says, nearly all the wisdom we possess, that is to say, true and sound wisdom, consists of two parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. But while joined by many bonds, which one precedes and brings forth the other is not easy to discern. And it's this idea that the more we learn about God, the more we can understand ourselves. And to some extent, the more we learn and understand ourselves, the more we're able to understand and learn and comprehend God. And so that's what he uses to introduce this idea of, if we know so much already, remember, this is targeted toward those who are already deep in their faith. Why? Why do we still get it so wrong so often?
And something that he said to kind of introduce this further was, we don't wake up in the morning as Christians intending to sin. We don't wake up and say, I'm going to be angry at my wife today. We wake up, the sun's shining. A lot of times we have these. If we wake up on the good side of the bed, we have every intention of living a life that's pleasing to the Lord, until you get out of bed and you step on your kid's toy on the bed, on the floor, and words start coming out of your mouth, or you have a bad day at work and you get home and you just want to rest, and you're something bugs you and you just explode. So what is that? So he's asking the question, where does that come from? Why? And I think Paul asked that same question, right? Why do I do what I don't want to do? Who will rescue me from this slavery? And I think we have the answer right after he says that. He says, "Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord." But we'll unpack that a little bit.
One of the things we were talking about in our staff discussion on this was that I've seen an object lesson that's really powerful, where a pastor took his cup and he was up, in front of the congregation, and he smacked the cup really hard, and his coffee flew out of it. And he said, why did that just happen? I said, well, because you smacked the cup. Why did that? That's clearly why the coffee flew out. And he said, no, the coffee flew out because there's coffee inside of here. So the point of that being, the bumps and the things in life that happen to us, Jesus promises that those things are going to happen. But we should be more concerned with what's in our cup than the bumps and the things that are happening. So the things that happen when you're stressed, when you're angry, that come out of your mouth should be an indication of, that's actually what's in my heart. And as scary as that is sometimes, I think there's grace to say that God knew that was there. That wasn't a surprise that you were just kind of keeping hidden from him. But I think we can take those moments and ask the Lord to say, God, I'm not proud of the fact that just came out, or that sin pattern has manifested itself in this way, but how can I use the knowledge of self in this situation to just resubmit myself to who you are?
And even as we're talking about this, I'm already feeling the feeling that I had when I listened to this from the first time, which is squirmishness. Like, this is starting to get convicting. I don't like how I'm feeling when I hear this. And what this has been paradigm shifting for me is being aware of that and starting to ask the question, why do I feel that way? And what do I do with that? Because my immediate reaction, even as we're talking right now, I still feel the old self that's wanting to be like, I suck. I and he, Dr. Coe, you haven't gotten a sense of it if you haven't listened to it yet. He's hilarious. So like he's talking about like we're leaking crap all over the place. So crap is a favorite word throughout the lecture series you'll hear, because that's what it is. It's the ugliness that's coming and rising up inside of us, and we don't like that. We want to stuff it back down, and we'll do everything we can to hide it. But as Tim was just saying, it's actually a grace of the Lord to expose that in our lives, because that's where this is coming from. This leaking out of us that feels like we can't even control it. That's actually a grace of the Lord as part of his sanctifying work in our lives to say, it's important for you to see this, because without seeing it, we can't deal with it. And unless you're honest with it, you won't come to me with it. You will continue to hide behind your fig leaves and hide behind your trees. And we can't deal with it until you acknowledge it and come to me with it.
You know, this is actually making me excited again, because I listened to this and I refused to talk to any of you guys about it because I wanted to save it for this conversation, right? So I've had all of these thoughts, all these notes, and I haven't had anyone to talk to about it. And I've been wanting to, but I can't talk to you about it yet because we need the microphones turned on. So now the microphones are turned on, and I feel like, yeah, we can talk about this stuff. And I'm excited about that. Although I suspect, y'all have both been through this before and y'all have talked about it with each other before. I haven't had anybody to talk to. So I'm just saying, I don't have a specific point here other than I'm just excited to be able to now hear how this impacted each of you and get to hear your thoughts on it. That's opens new perspectives and new feelings to it that I missed or I didn't hear the first time because I'm different than you are. And so I'm enjoying that quite a lot. And that idea, though, of that squirmishness or the revealed, like the spotlight's on you, I felt that then. And you're right. I'm feeling it again now. I don't like that feeling. And that seems to be part of his theme, right? Because then the very next talk that he gives, the very next section, number 3, is drawing near to God when God seems far away, maybe because we've pushed him away or that spotlight makes it feel impersonal and distant. What did y'all think about that third lecture?
Hold on, before we get there, I think there's a cool object lesson in some of this stuff. So the squeamishness that I felt when my sin is exposed, I liken to the fact that I hate working on cars. I've probably mentioned this multiple times in the podcast. Michael knows this intimately. But I hate it because I feel like my lack of knowledge of how the car operates is on full display at that point, right? Like I'm having to go to YouTube to figure this stuff out step by step and, find the right, procedures to get this thing done and hope that I've got the right set of tools. And I just feel like exposed for not knowing what I'm doing, right? But I think there's the cool parallel in that is that I have friends like Michael in my life who are farther along in their automotive walk than I am. And it's a blessing for him to be able to say, yeah, you don't know it right now, but we can work on it together. And I can talk to you about some things that you might need to know about, or I can give you some pointers and things. And there's a brotherhood and a fellowship there to where in the last year or so, I've gotten to the point where I've not been as intimidated to approach some vehicular issues. But I think there's a great parallel in that as we are willing to be exposed for not knowing what we don't know, or when we're exposed in relation to the sin issues here we're talking about, when we're willing to walk in the light with our brothers, with our community, I think First John has some things to say about that, and that's how the community was designed to work. So it's not something we should necessarily be afraid of, but it's something that God will use to grow us into his image.
So this next section, pivoting off of that, is delves into that topic of, so how does God do this work of exposing this and bringing us to this deeper level, which is really what it is, because until we deal with it, we can't go deeper because there's something we're still holding on to and clinging. It's a heart issue, really. Is our heart still focused on ourselves and the pleasure we're seeking? And because that's when we're reacting out of guilt, that's what that still is a clinging to self rather than a submitting to the Lord. So his main point, and this is really the theme of the rest of the series that he's been driving at, which is God often uses these times of dryness, which he calls dark nights of the soul. In fact, that's not new to him. That's actually an old term from, I think he said, the 16th century. Dark nights, these dark nights of the soul, that God uses them as a way to purge us and to expose this part of us, to draw us into a deeper relationship with him. So he talks about this idea of when you first become a believer, and we alluded to this earlier, you're often filled with these emotional highs. I had it in high school and junior high, into college. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, he talks about that as being a gift of the Lord, because that will drive you deeper into the word and deeper into prayer, because you're just so excited, right? This is also new and fresh, and God is amazing. God's awesome. And it feels really good. But he makes a good point that God doesn't want to leave you there, because you would become dependent on the pleasure that you're feeling. And he wants to also remove that part of your heart as well, to say, I shouldn't just love God for pleasure's sake, which is what he calls that stage. He wants to move us into the next stage, which is loving God for love's sake. And in other words, some verses come to my mind. We love because God first loved us. So there's an attractiveness, a beauty, that even if I don't feel the pleasure and the emotional highs right now, I can still have a deeper loving of the Lord that can only come from me really wrestling with, what am I feeling when I go through these dry seasons?
Yeah, I had one specific idea that I've had before, but he put words to it that, like, I'm going to use those words now forever, I think, because it's great. He called it the spirituality of causality. And I love that phrase. I've referred to it before as like treating God like he's a magic genie.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the same idea. It's the idea that if I do A, B, and C, then God owes me D, E, and F. Or if I just rub his magic lamp the right way, he has to come out and he's obligated to give me whatever it is I want. And this leads to several different things. One, it leads to the prosperity gospel idea that God owes me something because I've chosen to follow him. And ultimately, when you break that down, that's a super prideful thing. How wonderfully honored must God be that I've chosen to select him as my God? He should be thrilled and he should reward me. That's one thing, but just this idea of that if I do certain things, God's going to respond in a formulaic certain way. So therefore, I can get what I want from God, which is quite manipulative, but I can get what I want from God if I do the right things. And I think I'm making it kind of clear here so that it sounds almost absurd. Like, why would we ever do that? And then yet I find myself doing some of those things, or being open to some of those ideas in my own life in subtle ways. When life gets really hard and I'm just struggling with stuff, and it just seems like bump after bump after bump after speed bump, right? And then all of a sudden I'm just like, God, why are you letting this happen to me? Am I not right? Why do I deserve this? And it's like, oh, wait a second. That's essentially this spirituality of causality. Because in my head, I'm like, I'm not bad enough to deserve these things. Why are you letting these happen?
And let's be clear, like, you've had some pretty big speed bumps in the last year, even. Like, you've had some things going on in your life that have been very difficult and frequent.
That's true. It's been a rough 18, 24 months even. But yeah, that idea that easily crops up is, how in the world do I deserve this? That's that idea of, and it takes lots of different forms, right? But it's the idea that if I do certain things, God will respond in certain ways. And that's just not a biblical idea. God isn't obligated by anything that we do. He's obligated by his promises to keep his promises, but he's not obligated to keep our wishes or our whims. And when we seek those, that'll eventually let us down, because we've created an idol that cannot replace the actual God. So it will let you down. And so that's a bad place to be.
Because he knows what's best for us, right? So the analogy he uses, Dr. Coe uses here, is one of a bottle. So the pleasure that we had early on as a little baby Christian was like the bottle that you just love to suck on. And he has these great voices of, nom, 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 nom. You know, you're just sucking on the bottle of pleasure.
I call those great voices. They're a little weird.
Okay. Well, they're even better when you listen to the podcast at 1.5 speed and he sounds like a little gerbil. But so it's this idea of God's now going to take that bottle away and what are our reaction is guttural of like, give me the bottle back. I love the bottle as opposed to he has something so much more nourishing that he wants to move us into. And for me, Michael, you were sharing what that looks like for you. For me, it got this affected like how I even approach my quiet times, my prayer life. It was just getting so dry and yet I'm a very habitual person. And so, you know, I'm faithfully doing my quiet times every morning and I don't understand, God, why I don't feel you. And there's anger there. There's disappointment. There's self-doubt. Maybe I'm not even a Christian. You know, I'm not feeling this. Maybe, you know, there's a lot of that.
Those are some heavy questions that we wrestled through when you were going through that for the first time.
Yes. And they've been plaguing me for years. And if I'm being honest, they still do, because I'm still in this stage of looking out for, or starting by the Spirit, but continuing in the flesh, like Paul said. And this is helpful. This has been helpful for me to see, just as I can't break God's arm to say, if I read my scriptures every day, you should pour out your pleasures on me. In the same vein, I need to take the pressure off myself and say, I also can't, I'm not the one to make God love me any more or any less. And so he's the one that's doing the work of sanctifying me. And he's doing that by exposing this ugly desire to just love him for pleasure's sake. So that's been super helpful to expose in me.
One of the things that I really got out of this episode, if you will, he talks, and this is, I think he recorded this like early, like 2005-ish. So, I mean, this is not like a new series by any means, but he was talking about some generational differences and how our generation is more prone, for that emotional side of feeling things and being more authentic. And there's a lot of good things that come from the, that generational tendency. One of the pitfalls, he said, though, is that our tendency in the spiritual disciplines will be like, if we're not feeling, like if we're starting to feel distant from the Lord, we'll draw more on our tendencies of that emotional feeling and say, well, I don't want to do the disciplines then because I'm not feeling it in my heart. And those feelings can be a very misleading thing. And he talks about leading with the body instead of the heart. So continue to have those, times in the Word, and rather, when those feelings of dryness come, react to them in such a way like God is showing you something, right? Mm-hmm. Like if I don't want to be sitting there that morning reading the Word, he even says this, like, praise God. Like what? Mm. Why? Like, I mean, but what
does he actually say? What's our favorite phrase, Tim? I want to hear your reaction to, what I'm talking about?
I'm not recalling.
Yum, yum.
Oh yeah. So he does this like weird lip smacking thing, right? And it's super weird, but it sticks with you, I guess. But yeah, so that concept of, okay, so if that's how you're feeling, take that to the Lord. Be like, Lord, mm-hmm. I don't feel like being up at 5 o'clock in the morning right now and being in the Word. But continue to override that emotion essentially and still be there and show up. So
I think that for me may be the single most impactful thing that I heard said in the whole series. There were several highlights. This is vying for number one, and it may be, which was that with spiritual disciplines, always lead with the body. So do things like go to church, sing a song, kneel when you pray. If not every time, you don't have to, but do those things, fast. Choose to make physical discipline decisions to support your spiritual disciplines. And that was a big idea that he fleshes out quite a lot more than we can do right now. But that for me was a big deal.
And then he says, but the feelings that you're feeling when you're doing them are windows into your heart. So he says, pay attention to how you're feeling. So do them, go to church, read your Bible, pray, but how you're feeling in the moment, bring that before the Lord. So if you're in church and you're singing a song and you don't feel a thing, don't raise your hands, don't just go through the motions, but say, God, I'm not feeling you right now. I feel distant. I feel distracted. I feel guilty. And let that be an opportunity for you to go to your Father in love, because that's what he loves. I wrote down the verse, wherever I put it, Psalm 51, 16 and 17. God delights not in sacrifice, but a broken and contrite heart. God delights in a broken and contrite heart. That's actually the worship that we are to bring to him, is our need and our dependence. And that's what he loves, because that's honoring to him, because we're glorifying him for our need of him.
Yeah, all of my kids are second grade and under at this point, with the youngest being in preschool. But they are fully weaned from the bottle, and they can all eat steak right now. Right. So, we've been bringing them on this path of progression to where I can put a piece of steak on each of their plates. And if I were to take that away and give them back a bottle, they'd look at me cross-eyed and be like, what's going on here? Like, why did you do this to me? Right. But it's this concept that even at their young age, they would not want to go back to where they were even just a couple of years ago. And God, as a good and perfect Father, is taking us down that same road, where even though like that weaning process was difficult, right? There were nights of screaming, sometimes with the baby even, and it was a difficult process to get to where they can eat steak on their own. But now that they're there, like, that is such a rich experience in their life, that they wouldn't go back to what was before. So it's the same way with us.
Yeah. And I think that's a good opportunity to segue into this fourth lecture that he gave, which is the idea of just continuing on with God in these dark nights, right? He's still focused on, it's kind of almost part two, I felt, really, of this dark night idea. And he's just continuing to flesh that out more. And one of the things from there that I noted was he said that when we go through these desert areas, God is using it to purge our character, and he's going to use it to purge our vices and our self-reliant virtues. And he talked about how parents train into their children character, and that's on purpose. But that character only carries you so far before, as your maturity develops, that character starts to lend you toward legalism, because you think that character is what's making you right with God. So when you're 7 and your parents tell you, don't steal, that's good, and you shouldn't steal. But later in life, that can circle back on you, and you go, I'm a good person because I don't steal. And so now that virtue that served you well when you were younger to help you head in the right direction can become a stumbling block to you, because it's holding you back essentially at an immature or infantile level, which before it was pulling you forward in the right direction. But now you should be beyond that same space, that same level. And so it's actually become an anchor that's holding you down.
So he talks about a demographic of people in relation to that, right? Where they've kind of hit this plateau in their Christian walk, and they think, all right, well, this is the extent of it, right? This is as far as Christian life goes. And for some reason, like, the next logical step then is ministry, right? So I'm not going to grow anymore. So the next thing I'm going to do is just minister to people. And again, it's because you aren't doing that extra work to find out why is it dry. And spoiler alert, the next step at that point is not ministry. Ministry can be going on at any stage of this process. Like, I think should be an active portion of our lives as a growing and maturing believer, but it is not like the end all be all. We, even as leaders of this men's ministry, have committed ourselves to continue to grow and continue to develop our own walks with the Lord, because that's important. But one interesting thing that he says in that segment is that our character development is primarily not for our sake. It's for the sake of others, which I thought was really interesting. So the people that benefit most from my character development are going to be, my wife and my kids and the people that I'm ministering to. But there becomes a point in life where that's no longer a gift for me. It's a gift for others.
And he contrasts this with the first series of Dark Nights that he mentioned, where he says that God's trying to bring us to a place of loving God for love's sake. But he actually makes a point that that's actually still has a bit of self-centeredness, right? There's still an aspect of like, I am enjoying God's gifts of love and experiencing that. And he still has a deeper place that he wants to bring us. And so he calls this next stage of Dark Nights, which please don't think of this as like this linear process that everyone will follow perfectly. But these are kind of cycles that he in categories that he outlines. But this series of Dark Nights is he calls loving God for God's sake. And the perfect example he gives is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? So when Jesus is faced with the cross and he cries out, not my will, but yours be done. Take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours be done. That is the perfect example of what it means to love God for God's sake, because it is completely other-centered. He is now willing to go to the cross, even though he's going to experience the separation from God. So it's not loving God for love's sake, because he's going to experience a separation from that love of God, the hell that we all deserved. And so Jesus is in the stage, obviously, of loving God for God's sake. And he said that we all have a long, long way to go. And yet that is the journey that God wants to bring each of us on. And a lot of times, like Tim said, we want to just kind of stop when we start feeling this drive from the Lord to go deeper. It's much more comfortable to just stop here and let's just do ministry now and not go this extra stage, which takes me beyond my character, takes me beyond even my theology. And he wants to challenge all of that and bring us back to, him, back to a dependence on him.
Yeah. The quote that he ended with, I think, is he said, we need to move from trusting our character to trusting his work in our lives. And for me, that just, I want to say that hit home, but that makes it sound like I've understood it fully and incorporated it in my life. And I haven't yet. That I would say I'm at the stage where that blew my mind and I need to chew on it a whole lot more. And I think that it's right, but I'm afraid of some of the things that means for me and just how do I implement that and put that into work in my life. That's going to take time. But that statement from him was really powerful for me.
But it really loops back to that first lecture in the series, because we're depending on our character so much that when we see chinks in that armor, we have this moment of worry of, why am I still at this point in my Christian walk struggling with X, Y, or Z? And it's just like, well, because you don't get it, because that is what is in your cup. That is the best that we can offer, the filthy rags that we can offer. And you will never in this flesh be good enough. So when we depend on our own goodness and our own character, that quickly becomes a pretty self-defeating argument. The more that we truly experience the lack of depth that character really has. And I think that's really what he's getting at in this point, is that God's calling us to something even deeper than our own character. And that's to his character, right? We're not, going back to what I said earlier, we're not trying to be better Christians, better husbands. This is all about being transformed into the image and likeness of Christ.
And I wrestle with, I just want to arrive, right? Like I don't like the journey always, especially when it's painful and stretching and I see my own inadequacies. And so that's where the despair can come in, where this is the cycle that we are called to as Christians to keep going deeper, keep coming back to the Lord. And I feel like as soon as I arrived, I listened to the series once and I think I had a conversation with Tim that just felt, I was at the emotional high and I was just like, it's all going to be different now. I've had the spiritual paradigm shift. And then, the next week I was feeling, more dryness and it's easy to despair in those times when you think, man, I thought I had it. I thought I had it all figured out. It takes a level of humility to keep coming back to the Lord and saying, Lord, you have more that you want to teach me. I think the perfect counterexample, if Jesus is the perfect example, the perfect counterexample here is the Pharisee, right? who prays in the temple and says, Lord, thank you at least that I'm not like this man, this sinner. And you look, and Jesus paints the picture of the tax collector there who's beating his breast and can't even look up to heaven and say, Lord, have mercy on me. And Jesus says it's that man who goes away justified. And that's what he's calling us to, is one of brokenness and humility that's willing to keep coming back in repentance and in dependence on him. And Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And that was a verse that's really been sticking with me throughout this hard lecture series, because we just went through 4 very challenging lectures from Dr. Coe before we get to the 5th one, which is finally like, so what do we do about this? Like, you can get a sense of despair of, I've seen enough of my ugliness. Like, let's move on from this. But like, I needed that verse, come to me, those who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest, because that's what he's calling us to.
Which, as you were going through this series for the first time, Tyler, we were also going through a book together called Gentle and Lowly, which, Michael, you've now read as well. I think that's actually a perfect companion text for going through this study, because you really get a sense for Jesus's heart. And if that is not a deep theology that is deeply ingrained in your heart, and I would even say, like, at least for where I'm at in my spiritual walk, like, that is something I need to be reminded of constantly, because I'm constantly feeling, it's like I forget all the time that Jesus actually loves me in a deep, deep way. So I need to be reminded of that on a regular basis. But I think that book does an excellent job of just taking a single verse, that Tyler, you just mentioned, and looking at it from a whole bunch of different angles and facets, and really expounding on what that practically looks like in our lives. So Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortlund, if you haven't read that yet, I would highly, highly recommend it to you, especially as you read through or listen through something like this series.
Well said. I was about to say the same thing because it came to mind. So I was about to suggest it as well. All right. So then he ends on lecture 5. And I've got to say, for me, this 5th talk that he does, I was like, yeah, this is what I thought the whole series was going to be like. I thought it was going to be 5 of these. So I found it I'm not saying I expected all of the content. I'm saying I expected the style and the type of delivery and the kind of ideas that were in it. I was like, yeah, this is what the whole series is supposed to be, right? And I say that not to say that anything's wrong with it, because I think he did a masterful job. It felt reversed and backwards. It feels to me like this should be number 1, and number 1 should be number 5. And he even addresses that a little bit, that he does it out of order, that it's not out of order. It's out of the order of the way we expect, because this gives us some specific practical actions. And he can't give you that first, because if you give you that first, it just continues to feed this idea that your character, your choices, your holdfastness, your bootstrapping are what makes this happen. And so he has to tear all that away first and then give some of these things. And I found that I got it. The whole time I was so frustrated that why did he start with session 1 as session 1 all the way through until about here? And he started talking. I was like, I get it now. He couldn't have gone any other way. Did y'all feel like it was out of order?
I don't know if it was out of order. I just wanted to get straight to number 5, because this is getting back to the squirming of, like, you should have seen me with my mentor. We were talking about this every week, and I'd get to the end of one of these lectures. I'd be like, so what do I do? What do I do? And he said, Tyler, you're still acting under the old paradigm. You need to just take a step back. And Dr. Coe uses this analogy of, like, sitting in your weeds of, you're in the garden and you just want to pick the weeds. You see the weeds, you just want to pick them immediately. But when we realize that God is actually the gardener, he's the one that has to pick the weeds out of my life. And there's a sense in which he first needs us to look around and see the ugliness in our heart, so that we know that what we need to be saved from, so that we know this dependence. And that's why I think Dr. Coe uses so much of his 8 hours out of his 10 hours to bring us to this place of almost desperation on the Lord before we're ready to say, yes, there is a part and there are practical steps that we are called to take. But make sure as we go about them that we're doing them in the power of the Holy Spirit, and not, again, to get out of this guilt feeling or to get God to do what I want him to do and make me feel the pleasure again. Otherwise, we'll just get right back in the cycle.
Yeah. And we talk about clearing weeds. That brings up a very specific memory of when I went through a discipleship course at my church that really kind of hammered home on some of these same points that we're going through now. But I was very concerned at that point in my life of, let's just use landscaping as an example here, right? I've got dandelions growing up through the cracks in the sidewalk, and I think, all right, got the weed whacker out. It's 40 volts of suburban power, and I'm just going to level these things. But the problem is, 3 days later, you've got the same weeds coming up through the cracks, because we're addressing, again, something at a very high level when the roots of those things are down deep. And the only one that can really handle those things is the master gardener, right? I have a piece that's here in my office right now. It's a concrete table, and we can post a picture of it maybe in the show notes. But at first glance, it probably just looks like a weird piece of modern art, because the concrete, I intentionally broke it, and then repaired it and filled it back in with gold inlay. So there's this Japanese style of artwork called kintsugi, where they take broken pottery and fill it back in with gold, so that what was broken is more beautiful repair than it was when it initially started out. And it's a beautiful form of artwork, and I think there's a lot of biblical truth that's even expressed in that form of art. But it's something I've built into this table, because when I was just willing to look at the stuff in the cracks of the sidewalk, the Lord was like, no, we're going to bust through this concrete sidewalk, and we're going to dig out those roots, and we're going to repave the sidewalk, and it's going to be better than it was when it first got started. So when I look at that table and I see those, the streams of gold that kind of interweave their way through that concrete, it just reminds me of the work that God is doing in my life, to go deeper and to, not just be concerned about, the sins that are up here at that top level that keep popping up, that, he's more concerned with what's going on in my heart. And that's been a journey for me. And it's one of those things too, that it's not, I learned that once and now I'm good to go. I needed to be reminded of it again when we were going through this series, because it's something that, again, my heart just likes to forget.
Yeah. And I think that's why that's such a big theme in the Old Testament, right? Remember, you have all these different feasts and celebrations, because we forget by nature as humans. We forget and layer in the sinful nature in there, and we purposefully want to gravitate back to ourselves. But so practical, there's some practical things that Dr. Coe lays out in this final series, and he references the spiritual disciplines. If you haven't heard that before, that's a common, was it especially back in the 90s, like Dallas Willard and Richard Foster. Do I have those names right?
Yep.
They both wrote books around the same time, I think, of spiritual disciplines, and did a great job. So he references those a lot. But and I've studied those a little bit, but what he helped is kind of demystify it for me a little bit, because I still saw the spiritual disciplines as like a concrete list of, these are the things that you can do, again, to get back into the good graces of the Lord. And that's not how Foster and Willard approached it, but that's how I kind of approached it when I had been taught it. And so what he kind of helps reshape it for us is this is about spiritual training. New Testament talks a lot about training as a soldier, training as an athlete. That's language of sanctification. We know that it's under the power of the Holy Spirit, but there's an aspect where he calls us to do certain things. And so what he's doing is just kind of laying out some practical ways of how we can go about this training. And he weaves in the spiritual disciplines, but it's not just, pick this discipline off the shelf and do it, and then put it back, and then take this one and put it back. He has a more kind of holistic way that he looks at that.
I found that to be helpful. As I said, like, that was the thing I was waiting for, like, the whole way through, kind of. And I didn't really realize it until I wasn't getting it, right? In the first 4, he's not talking about these things. I'm like, something's missing. I know what's missing. He needs to be, like, very specific. How do I do this? And then when he got there, I was like, yeah, this is it. But I also felt almost a sense of disappointment isn't the right word, but maybe it partially is. I'm not disappointed in him, not disappointed in the content he delivered, but like, I'm hoping at the end of this, there's like a really easy silver bullet. There's like a pill I can take. There's got to be like a certain prayer I can pray, or maybe there's a Bible verse that I just missed that, like, if I just read that
multi-level
verse,
marketing we can sign up for.
right? There's got to be something here. There's like an oil I rub on it, and all this gets fixed. And so when he gave these very specific, several practical things and said, "Hey, this isn't necessarily easy," I felt that I was like, "This isn't going to be easy." Nor are these things that, like I just want the, like, okay, but that's nice, but who can I pay to just do this for me?
Yeah.
Right? Like, Tyler, can you just do them twice and I'll just get the benefit of them? And that's a weird thought and a weird tension, and I don't really know fully what to do with it. But that was kind of my feeling, which was a sense of almost kind of just disappointment. That's like, oh, you mean I've got to do, like, there's work, but but also this element of, but we just spent 4 sessions talking about, I can't do the right way. It's not about the works, and this, I can't do that. So it's just this weird, almost emptiness feeling. But I think that is in no way, am I discrediting Dr. Coe. I'm saying that just shows how deep this is all messed up, is that when I'm told, hey, it's not all these things, and I go, yeah, okay, I know it, but it is these things, and I go, but couldn't it have been something else? and I think that just exposes. Did y'all feel that way too? Is that just me?
Oh, absolutely. I'm still kind of wrestling with, like, okay, so we're supposed to sit in our crap, right?
Yeah.
But how do you do that practically? Like, I mean, is that like a 20-minute session I need to, fit into my schedule every week where I sit in crap? Like, how does that look? I don't know.
How do I put it on my calendar? How do I just, like, box this in and make this happen and move on with other things and become more spiritual mature in the process?
But as I asked you guys that question, as we were talking about as a group, I think that's part of it, right? I think some of it is like, okay, I probably need to be in a better habit of exposing some of these dark areas of my life, and just sitting in it being like, here's me. This is me this week. That's how I screwed it up. And just being vulnerable and honest with you guys and with Angela about that stuff too. And that's hard.
I think that's some of the hardest part of all this is it's subjective. There's not just a rule book to follow as much as I want it to be. I want, like the Pharisees, I want the 612 rules to just kind of hedge me in. And if I am just in within those rules, within that confines, I'm good. And that's exactly what Jesus really criticized them about is they missed it. They missed the heart of God because they were so focused on, give me the list so that I can just kind of follow that. So that's where Dr. Coe really helped me take a step back with this series. As much as I wanted him to go into those specifics as well, he kind of laid out, if you haven't listened to it yet, so this idea of regimens, rhythms, and intentions. We won't have time to get into all three of them, but the idea is there are always commands of the Lord that you either read in scripture yourself in your quiet time, or you're here in a sermon. And the first step is, what do you do with them? You're a human and you only have so much capacity to work on so much at any one time. So the very first thing is, if you feel convicted or you're feeling a command of the Lord, you go before the Lord and you say, is this something that you want me to work on? And there's going to be certain things that are more important than others, and that takes wisdom and discernment and prayer before the Lord. But then once you've identified kind of what are some things that I'm feel the Lord's calling me to work on, some of the crap that's surfaced recently that has been especially enlightening for me. The first step is that regimen, which is a very specific short-term goal that you can set. Let's say a week. So if I heard a sermon about how to love my wife better, and I'm convicted by that, I feel like the Lord is wanting me to grow in that this week. Setting a specific goal of what can help me become the type of person that the Lord's calling me to be. So not just what do I need to do right now to love my wife better, but who do I need to become? I need to become a husband that looks like this, a husband who is having more conversations with his wife, who is listening better, who is more understanding, that type of thing. And so what are the things that can help me reach that? The regimen would say, okay, maybe I will take 4 hours out of the week to just pray for my wife. And so maybe it's 30 minutes a day, or maybe it's just, I'm just going to listen to her and just have it more opportunities to just sit down and have conversations and listen with her. So very practical. You don't see that in the list of spiritual disciplines, but this is the day-to-day grind of spiritual training of like, this is something that God is calling me to work on. And I'm just putting myself in a position before the Lord to make those opportunities more available. That doesn't make me a more loving husband, but it gives me more opportunities to practice it and rely on the Lord as I go through those.
Yeah, I think reliance on the Lord is really, really the key there. It's how do I walk with the Lord in these things? The Holy Spirit is leading you to. It's very much a hand-in-hand process that's happening there.
So, it's not lost on me that we mentioned that he lists these very specific practical things. And I think people listening along are like, yeah, good. What are those things? And I don't think they belong here fully listed in this conversation, because
no, you need to listen to the 10 hours.
Yeah, you need to hear it directly from Dr. Coe. You need to let him unpack it. You need to not skip just to conversation 5. You need to work your way all the way through it. This shouldn't be a cliff notes just to get to those. If you're feeling frustrated by me saying that right now, I think that's kind of the point, right? Is that we just want to get to that bottom line quickly. And that's
Dr. Coe
not
says,
Yum, yum, yum.
He does on occasion. That's true. So I think we leave this. I think we leave this here. I don't think we list those specific things more than we have. And I think we leave this here saying, if you haven't listened to it yet, go do. If you've already listened to it, great. Go do that again at some point in your future, right? Like let this soak through your life and marinate on it again. So, Tim, Tyler, closing thoughts on this whole Coe series?
So I would say the way that we're going through it, right? Just us listening to it and then talking about it as a staff, which is really a close-knit group of friends, has been really helpful for me. Tyler, talking through it with you has been really helpful for me.
Yeah, and I felt frustrated mildly that I don't have anybody to talk to, about it, because I'm trying to save it for this recording, which we're doing now, which is great. But yeah, there's I can imagine that y'all have had a wonderful time being able to talk about it in the past, because I've wanted that.
So part of my challenge and encouragement would be like, okay, so if you've listened to it, or even if you haven't listened to it yet, pull some buddies in it with you, pull your wife in it with you, and make this a community effort where you listen to it and then have somebody to talk to about it. And as you kind of process through a lot of these things. And if you already have a mentoring type relationship or a discipleship relationship, this is perfect content for the two of you or the group of you to work through together. But we also kind of want to hear the feedback on that too, right? Like if you're doing that, how did it work? I'd be very curious to hear that.
Yeah, if you listened to this in advance and you had different highlights than we did, we'd love to know what your highlights are, because we don't get to know what those are, because this is kind of a one-sided conversation. Partially, you're getting to eavesdrop into our conversation together, but we'd like to know about yours. So if you would, send us an email with some of the things that really stood out to you or some of the things that impacted you. And then if you haven't listened to it yet, we'll put the whole link again in the description. So you can go to the webpage where they're all listed. You can listen to the audio files. There's also like a summary kind of transcript, so you can read some of the content. There's an outline of stuff. So we'll put that all there so that you can find it and do it. And then maybe after you've listened to it, you'll come back and listen to this episode again, and it'll mean more to you. I don't know. Men, thanks for joining us on this episode of the Ironcenturion podcast, a Christ-centered adventure into leadership, manliness, and brotherhood. Tim, Tyler, it was great to talk with you guys. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks,
Talk to
guys.
you later.
Bye.